Hey, welcome to Saved and Besieged by Flippin' Tables. This is a place where faith meets the fight, and your permission to be brutally honest about your pain without letting go of Jesus. This is a space for the burned, the bruised, and the barely hanging on. No sugarcoating, no shallow faith, just raw hope, real theology, and a God who refuses to walk out when life gets ugly. Saved and Besieged by Flippin' Tables, for the wrecked, the raw, and the rising. Hey, this is Cece.
And I'm JR.
Together we're JRCC. Our mission is simple, to bring you one podcast at a time about faith.
Not the polished, sugar-coated version, but real faith.
The kind that wrestles doubts, cries out, and still finds Jesus in the mess.
That's what Saved and Besieged is all about.
Welcome to today's episode, where we dive deeper into the powerful journey of healing, redemption, and transformation. In this episode, we're talking about something that all of us can relate to: damage. We all carry some form of pain, whether it's from childhood trauma, addiction, broken relationships, or even mistakes we've made. But here's the truth: your damage doesn't define you. In this episode, we'll explore how God takes our brokenness and turns it into something beautiful. We will see how God's grace takes our deepest pain and transforms it into purpose. We'll discuss how to bring your damage to God, not as a burden that you have to hide, but the very thing that He can use. We will talk about the power of your testimony, how healing is a choice, and why you are more than your damage. You're more than your past. So if you've ever felt like your story is defined by your pain or failures, this episode is for you. Let's dive in and explore how God can flip your season. We all have a story, one that's shaped by the moments we wish that had never happened, the things we can't take back, and the experiences we'd rather just forget. But here's the truth: the damage that comes with those experiences doesn't just disappear. It doesn't get wiped away, no matter how much we wish it would. Sometimes the damage is subtle, like the scars we carry deep inside, unseen by anyone else, but it's there, and it has a way of shaping us, whether we're ready for it or whether we want it. The damage that's not transformed is transferred. It's passed down to us in ways that we can't always understand. It's the unhealthy patterns we inherit from our families, the emotional baggage passed from one generation to another, the wounds left by actions, words, labels that are never healed. And while we might not have caused the damage, we can't help but feel its weight. What happens to us when we were young, things that are done to us, the things we witness, all of them shape who we become. And sometimes if we try to move on without working through them, those things get transferred. They end up defining us, even when we don't want them to. Let me take you back to the story of Mephibosheth, a boy who didn't choose his circumstances, but was forever marked by them. Mephibosheth's story starts long before he was dropped and crippled. It starts with the king, King Saul, who had everything, yet he lost it because of disobedience and jealousy. God had placed Saul in charge, had given him everything he needed to lead, but his pride, his fear, and his disobedience caused him to fall from grace. Saul's mistakes led to a ripple effect. His son Jonathan was loyal to his father, but because of his father's decisions, Jonathan lost his life in battle. And then there was Mephibosheth, Jonathan's young son, who was caught in the middle of it all. He wasn't responsible for Saul's disobedience, yet he still paid the price. Mephibosheth's damage wasn't his fault, but it became his reality. And that's the story that most of us are in. It's easy to look at Mephibosheth's situation and think, oh, what a tragedy. But the truth is, his story is ours too. How many of us are living out consequences that we didn't create? How many of us are carrying the weight of things that were done before we even had a voice, whether it was trauma, abuse, addiction, neglect, or unhealed wounds from childhood? Many of us are still living with the aftermath of someone else's choices. And often, these damages come with no warning. They come early. They come before we've even had control over what we're experiencing. It comes when we're most vulnerable and we're trying to figure out who we are and where we fit in the world. Think about it. How many of us are still carrying things from our past that we didn't ask for? Maybe it's the emotional scars left from a parent's addiction, or the invisible wounds from being bullied at school. Maybe it's the shame you carry from a past mistake, or the pain from someone who loved you, or you loved and who walked away. You didn't cause that, but you're still living with it. The greatest time to kill a king is when he's a kid, and the enemy knows this. He understands that when we're young and impressionable, that's when the damage sticks. That's when the seeds of insecurity, fear and shame are planted. Now, the enemy just doesn't attack our physical bodies. He attacks our potential early. He strikes when we're the most vulnerable, before we even know what we're capable of, before we even know the power we have within us. And often the damage isn't obvious at first. It takes time to show up. And when it does, it defines the way we see ourselves and how we interact with the world. For Mephibosheth, the damage was physical. He was dropped at a young age and became crippled, unable to walk. But for many of us, the damage is emotional, mental, and spiritual. It's the things we know we carry, but we can't see. The wounds left by harsh words, unfair expectations, the absence of love and support. It's the constant feeling of not being enough, the fear of failure that paralyzes us from stepping into what we're truly called to do. Those are the silent battles we fight, the invisible chains that hold us back. Stay tuned while we talk about the next bit. Damage isn't always our fault, but it becomes our burden. Still with us? This is Saved and Besieged by Flippin' Tables. Faith in the middle of the fight. Let's dig deeper. What's hard to accept is that damage often isn't our fault, yet it becomes our burden to carry. We didn't ask for the dysfunction in our homes or the broken promises or the experiences that scarred us. And sometimes we don't even realize how much they shape our behavior. It's the family trauma that gets passed down from generation to generation. It's the words spoken over us when we're too young to defend ourselves. It's the addictions or the mental health struggles or the labels that are put on us. The quiet one, the troublemaker, the failure, and we've all been there. We've been hurt in ways that we didn't deserve. And just like Mephibosheth, we find ourselves crippled by things that happened before we had a voice. And here's the truth. The damage doesn't have to define you. God has a different plan for you. You can choose to heal. But the first step begins when you acknowledge the damage and decide that it won't control your future. In Mephibosheth's story, the damage didn't end with his fall. What happened to him didn't define the rest of his life. Yeah, it defined a lot of his life, but it didn't define the end, because God took what was broken and turned it into something beautiful. Here was a young man who was dropped when he was about 5 years old by the nurse, the one who was supposed to care for him. And that's what happens to a lot of us. The people that were meant to care for us drop us, and that leaves us paralyzed in shame. Because think about the culture back then. Having a crippled boy, especially a boy, meant that he couldn't lift his face in public and he just had to hide away. And that is the shame that a lot of us face. But just like Mephibosheth, your story isn't defined by your damage. You are more than the damage that you carry. So don't let people make issue with your identity. So if we go back to 2 Samuel chapter 9 verse 3, Ziba answered the king, and this is David standing and asking, is there anyone left in Jonathan's family? Because I want to do something for them. And Jonathan, though he was Saul's son and Saul was out to kill David, he was still David's best friend, and he had just died in battle. And Ziba answers David, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in both feet. Do you see the way people label? Even back then, even now, he is crippled in both feet. There's no name given. He is just a cripple. So what is the first thing people say about you when they describe you? Is it your past mistakes? The time you fell off the wagon? The times you went back to the bottle? The way you couldn't make relationships work? Or how your marriage fell apart? Maybe they call you the addict, the liar, the failure, the cripple. You've been labeled by your worst moments. You're the person who got arrested. You're the person who was abused. The person who couldn't get clean. The person who couldn't get things together. And no matter how hard you try, that label sticks. But here's the thing. The enemy wants you to believe that your issue is your identity. That it's one and the same thing. Your problem or your damage is not your identity. He wants you to stay trapped in the label that was slapped on you after a mistake. The fall, the shameful moment. And he wants you to believe that because you've made a mistake or because something happened to you, that's all you are. He wants you to forget that you are bigger than your condition. Let's look at Mephibosheth. When Ziba answered David's question about Saul's family, he doesn't call him by his name. He doesn't say, there's a son of Jonathan. He should have been a prince. He's still living. No, Ziba says, there's a son of Jonathan. He's crippled in both feet. He's described by his condition, not his name. Now, isn't that what we do to ourselves and people do to us? We define ourselves by our pain, by our damage, by our trauma, by our worst moment, our deepest shame. We let that one part of our story, the part that's broken, the part that's wounded, we let that become our whole story. And if you've ever been labeled, you know the weight it carries. Maybe it started with a mistake, or maybe it started with something that was done to you, something that ended up changing the way people saw you. But then we end up seeing ourselves the way people do. Maybe it was the time you messed up big, the addiction that everyone knew about, the lies that came out of your mouth when you were trying to protect yourself, the abusive relationships that just seem to follow you around. Once you're branded, it's like a permanent stamp. And if you've been caught in addiction, you know the power of that label. It's not just a diagnosis or a struggle. It becomes your identity. There's no more to you apart from that label. People don't see you as the person you are. They see you as the addict. You could have tried to quit 1,000 times, but no one sees that. No one sees the persistence because you're just reminded of the label. People look at you as the failure, and deep down, you start to believe them. But hear me out. What if that's not who you are? What about when you've been through the abuse and now every relationship feels like it's cursed? That becomes your label. And the more people tell you that label, the more you start telling it to yourself. You're the abused one, the one who's always hurt, always broken. And then that becomes your story, even when you don't want it to. And then there are self-inflicted labels, the liar, the cheater, the one who never gets it together. We carry those labels like weights on our shoulders and we let them define us. And that's just a normal part of human life. But hear me out. Just because people see you that way or just because you see yourself that way, it's not who you are. Just because you've struggled with something or something was done to you, you are not your issue. You could have done it, had it done to you, but you are not it. And how many of us have been stuck in a cycle where what we did or what was done to us has now become who we are. Your actions or someone else's actions cannot define your identity. Think about Mephibosheth, his fall. His injury was a tragedy that marked him for life. He was crippled, but that wasn't his identity. He wasn't the crippled one or the broken son of Jonathan. He was Mephibosheth. That's who David saw when he called for him. And that's who God sees when he looks at you. Not the addictions, not your mistakes, not the pain. He sees you for what he created you to be. You are not your damage. So stay tuned for the next bit where we talk about the power of your name and who you are as a person. Ever questioned if God still hears you? You're not alone. This is Saved and Besieged with JRCC. Let's get back into it. Think about it. There's something incredibly powerful about a name. A name carries weight. It's your identity, your story, your legacy. And the enemy wants to strip that away. Wants you to forget who you are by defining you by his labels. But God calls you by your name. Just like David called for Mephibosheth, not the crippled son, but as Mephibosheth. And God calls you by your true name. Think about it. Your name is precious to God. When he created you, he didn't make a mistake. He didn't make you by accident. You're not defined by what you've been through, the labels that have been given to you, or by what you've given yourself. You're defined by God's love and the purpose he has for your life. Your identity is not wrapped up in your past, your mistakes, or what anybody thinks. You are more than your condition, and you are created for greatness. So it's time to stop looking at yourself through the lens of damage. Yes, the abuse happened. Yes, the abuse tried to take you down. Yes, the addiction did as well. Yes, the lie you told might haunt you. But that is not who you are. What would happen if you began to see yourself how God sees you, as his redeemed, restored, and loved child? What if you started to separate your identity from your issue? What if you stopped answering to the labels and started answering to the name God calls you? You are not the sum of those labels. You are the sum of God's grace, his purpose, and his love. And it's time to let go of those labels that have held you captive. It's time to stop letting your issue define you. God has called you by your name. Nothing dictates your future. The addiction, the trauma, those labels, they are not who you are. Mephibosheth's life was forever changed when David called him by his name. He was seen as who he was created. And it's time to separate your identity from your issue and walk in that freedom that God has already given you. So there are a few verses. If you look at 2 Samuel 9:7, David invites Mephibosheth. And we all have damage. It's the stuff that sits in the background of our lives, waiting to show up when we least expect it. But here's the thing. God isn't afraid of your damage. He isn't repelled by your brokenness, your insecurities, or your past. He's not waiting for you to clean up your act before you come into Him. God is not ashamed of the parts that you might be ashamed of. He doesn't turn His back when He sees your wounds. He embraces them because He's the only one who knows what to do with them. And the first thing God does with our damage, He calls for it. He doesn't want you to hide it, or He doesn't demand that you stuff it down. He doesn't want you to pretend that it's not there. When David invites Mephibosheth to his table, it's not a formal invitation. It's a radical act of grace that set the scene for hundreds of years later when Jesus did the same thing. Mephibosheth didn't have to earn his seat. He didn't have to prove he was worthy. In fact, by the world's standard, he was the last person who deserved a seat at the table. But David didn't care about that. He cared about something deeper. He cared about Mephibosheth as a person. And it's the same way God calls us to come as we are, with all our damage, our baggage, our brokenness. He invites us to bring all of that out of hiding, to step into His presence with all the hurt and pain that we've tried to cover up. He's not looking for a perfect version of you. There is no perfect version of any of us. He's looking for you exactly as you are. It's tempting to hide your damage. After all, who wants to show the world the parts of themselves that are broken? We'd rather keep those things hidden, tucked away in the dark corners of our heart. But the truth is, God can't heal what we're unwilling to bring to Him, what we're unwilling to show. He can't transform what we keep locked away. And when Mephibosheth is brought to David, his injury and his damage is no secret. Everybody knows he's crippled, but David doesn't see him as a crippled. He sees him as Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth. He sees us as children worthy of grace. Let's be real for a second. Sometimes we don't have the strength to carry our own damage. There are days when the weight of our past, the trauma, the mistakes, the abuse, the guilt, feel too heavy to bear. We can't fix ourselves. We can't always find the strength to pull ourselves out of the darkness. And in those moments, God carries us. He doesn't ask us to carry our burden alone. Remember, Zechariah 4:6 says, "Not by might or power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord." It's not by your strength or ability that you'll find healing. It's by God's Spirit, His grace, that will carry you through. When David invites him to sit at the king's table, Mephibosheth is still crippled. He can't walk. But David doesn't ask him to walk to the table on his own. He doesn't ask that Mephibosheth get up and prove his worth. He carries him to the table. Even when we don't have strength, God steps in and does what we can't do for ourselves. And there are days when you won't have the strength to keep going. Days when the weight of your damage feel like it's too much. But that's when His grace is most evident. And one of the most powerful aspects of God's grace is how He covers our shame. Mephibosheth's legs were crippled. They're a reminder of his brokenness. But when David invited him to the table, Mephibosheth's legs were hidden. At the king's table, he was no longer seen as the crippled grandson of Saul. He was seen as a son, one of David's own. And his condition didn't disqualify him, because when he made him sit and he pulled up the chair, his legs were under the table, and all people could see was Mephibosheth, not the cripple. And that is the beautiful truth of the gospel. God covers our shame when we bring Him our brokenness. He doesn't leave us exposed. He uses it, just like He's using Mephibosheth's story to talk to yours. In the same way, when we come to Jesus, our shame is covered by His righteousness. We don't have to hide our wounds because He's already covered them. Grace is the covering we can't create for ourselves. We try to cover up our mistakes, our failures, our shame. But when His grace extends, it's permanent. It's not based on what we do or don't. It's based on who God is. Even when faith feels fragile, God hasn't walked out. You're listening to Saved and Besieged. Let's keep walking together. There is nothing we can do to earn God's grace, and there is nothing we can do to fix ourselves unless God steps in. He invites us to His table. He carries us when we can't walk, and He covers our shame with the grace that only He can give us. This isn't about self-improvement. It's not about working harder or being better. It's about surrendering the damage we carry, surrendering the shame we feel, and letting God cover us with His grace and love. Mephibosheth didn't have to fix himself to be accepted by the king. And you don't have to fix yourself to be accepted by God. He sees you as His child, not as your condition. He calls you to His table, just as you are. broken, damaged, crippled, all of it. He doesn't expect perfection because he knows we can't be perfect. He just wants you to come as you are. And when you do, he takes you to places you never thought you could go. And he covers you with a grace that heals and restores. Sometimes it feels like we're trapped in a season of pain, stuck in a loop of struggle, failure, and regret. And sometimes the damage can feel permanent, like the cracks in your heart can never be healed, like the mistakes from your past are tattoos on your soul, that no matter how hard you try, they never fade. But here's the thing, God doesn't need a lifetime to change your life. He can flip your entire season, your whole perspective. And it's in that moment of decision, when you stop hiding from your pain and stop holding on to it and just give it to God, that he begins to transform your story. He can turn your mourning into dancing, and he takes the broken pieces of your life and reshapes them into something beautiful, into your destiny. Let's look at Mephibosheth again. When we meet him, he's hiding, he's crippled, living in a place of shame and isolation, far from the comforts of the king's palace. He was the son of Jonathan, yet he had no place at the table, no throne to inherit. His condition was not just physical, it was emotional, psychological, and spiritual. And here's the thing, when God looks at your life, whether you're going through shame, trauma, or whatever, he needs to use that. And when we surrender what we have and what we're going through, our pain, and stop living in the shadow of your past, defined by your injuries, your family's downfall, the tragedies of your childhood, that's when God looks at it and says, yes, I will take it and I will use it for someone else. Because that's the whole point of God's heart. He doesn't want you to just walk around with your pain. When we expose our pain, our trauma, our grief, that's when everything changes. Because the whole point of Jesus's commission was go into the world and make disciples. Yeah, a lot of us think, and a lot of Christians believe that when he says that, it means we need to go out and make everybody a Christian. No, discipleship is showing and exposing who you are. Exposing your trauma, that it's not rose-colored glasses all the time. We have a messy middle part in our faith. And when someone sees your messy middle, they know that they can come as they are as well. They don't have to be perfect. Because guess what? The world knows that none of us are perfect. No one is. And when Christians have the persona that when you find Jesus, all of a sudden you're perfect and you're able to tell someone else how they should or shouldn't live their life, that's not making people disciples. That's pushing people away. And we don't want to be known as Christians who do that. Why would you push someone away even before they found Jesus? That's discipleship, exposing your messy middle. So when we look at Mephibosheth's story, when David calls him, he didn't wait for Mephibosheth to be fixed or prove his worth. He invited him to sit at his table, to be covered, to be honored, and to experience a new identity. Yes, everyone at the table saw him as a cripple, but everyone at the table also saw that he was accepted. And everyone could see that Mephibosheth's position was shifted from shame to honor, from isolation to inclusion. The damage didn't disappear, but it was no longer what defined him. And that is what we as Christians need to look at. That is discipleship. We want to accept people as they are. Because again, like I said in the previous weeks, who am I to judge whether your crippled legs or your traumatized soul or any of that is going to make you unfit for the table? And this was not just a physical healing. This was a redemption of his identity. And God can do the same for you. No matter where you are right now in your life, no matter where you've been, no matter what your damage, addiction, abuse, broken relationships, or trauma, those are not your labels. That's not who you are. God doesn't see you as that. He sees you as his child. And God will flip your position. He can take you from being crippled by your circumstances, by your past, to feeling covered by his grace. So remember that the next time. If you are down because of your trauma, because of your past, because of labels that you've put on yourself from what others have put on you, change that position. Let's not keep collecting the trash that people have put on our lives. Let's not do the devil's work for him. Let's keep our identity as what God wants us, as who he sees us, not as what the world thinks, because we both know from experience, the world's never going to be satisfied with who you are. But God is. God knows who he created. He saw you and he knows everything about us. And he's accounted for our foolishness. He's accounted for our mistakes. And all he's looking for is for us to stop in that moment and go, yep, there's been some things that define me. There's been some things that I've gone through. But there are parts that abuse can't negate. that trauma can't take away, because that is the destiny that God has put in us. And all He wants right now from our lives is to know that we're going to use our damage, to use our trauma, to use our struggle to help someone else. Because that's the whole point of Christianity, to show people that you can come as you are. You don't need to be fixed up. You don't need to fit into someone else's labels. Yeah, they might say you're not dressing right, you aren't doing things right, you aren't speaking right, you still struggle. But again, who am I to put a limit on what God can use? Who am I to say, oh, you're crippled and you're not welcome? Because that's not my job. God didn't put me there to decide whether you are accepted or allowed at the table. And God didn't put you in that position either. So if someone wants to come as they are, that's the position that we need to give them and allow them to flip. Because that is what God is looking for. God is not looking for perfection. He wants you to come as you are. Tell Him, talk to Him about what's going on, and He is going to use it to bring a huge change into your life. Stay tuned for next week, but we'll continue this conversation, changing your damage into destiny. We'll look at Peter and we'll look at the guy who had to pick up his mat. You've been listening to Saved and Besieged by Flippin' Tables, and this has been JRCC. Thanks for listening. And that's a wrap for this week's episode of Saved and Besieged by Flippin' Tables. Stay tuned. Next week, we'll dive even deeper into the trenches with a conversation you won't want to miss. We'll talk about the battles no one sees, the prayers that feel like they bounce off the ceiling, and why God's still in it with you, even when you're ready to tap out.
In the meantime, if you want to go even further, check out our books on faith, addiction and survival at flippintables.co.nz. They're raw, real and written for the wrecked, the raw and the rising.
Until then, keep fighting, keep trusting, and remember, Jesus never walks out when life gets ugly.